This is showing you cellular damage that occurred in animals that were prenatally exposed to mobile phone radiation that was produced by a computer simulating the mobile phone exposure under controlled conditions. Just 15 minutes a day for 7 days. Not much exposure. But these are small animals, and they grow within 3 weeks. They reproduce. And what they were able to study was changes in liver malonaldehyde, which is a measure of peroxidation. It's a measure of damage to the liver, right? So these animals basically had significant damage to their liver if they had been exposed prenatally compared to controls. Now, another group in Turkey has looked at prenatal effects on the brain and the testis. And they looked at counting the number of cells in certain areas of the brain, the hippocampus, which is a critically important part of the brain. Your hippocampus is pretty important to things like memory, balance, things like that. After they had been exposed prenatally, and compared those who were exposed to those who were not exposed. And they looked at their brain cells, the number of cells, their shape, etc., with established methods for testing this. And this article was published in Brain Research, which is a relatively high impact journal. And what they showed was that prenatally exposed newborns have basically fewer cells in the hippocampus. Here's the exposed, missing some cells, and here are the controls, which they're compared with. And you can see here that these cells are, there's more of them, here they're more scattered, and in fact, they did another test of memory. Now, how do you test memory in an animal? You don't have them fill out the crossword puzzle. You test memory in an animal with well-established protocols of learning. You teach them to run a maze and get a food reward, and you see how long it takes them to do that. And what they did is a radial arm maze. They trained these animals who were starving to get a food reward, right? And after they did that, they then saw how long did it take them to learn this if they had been prenatally exposed to mobile phone radiation. And what they found was that newborns that had been exposed took 3 times as long to find their way out of an experimental maze and made twice as many errors. And this, again, is a statistically valid method for evaluating learning. Now, closer to home, so to speak, between the brain and the testis, studies have been done here in Australia at Newcastle by a fellow who's now the pro-chancellor of the university. And these studies have been done taking sperm from healthy men. And one test tube gets exposed to cell phone radiation, and one test tube is not exposed to mobile phone radiation. And then the results are evaluated. And this is a measure of vitality. We measure how well the sperm swim. This is a measure of motility. This is a measure of mitochondrial DNA damage. They have 3 times as much damage on their DNA if they have been exposed to mobile phone radiation as compared to controls. This is the data from the Cleveland Clinic showing that men who keep cell phones in their pockets the longest have the lowest sperm count. This is a normal testis. You see the boundaries of the cell wall. It looks very nice. And this is after microwave radiation exposure. The breast. The breast is mostly fat, contains a lot of fluid. Things that contain fat and fluid cook faster in the microwave oven. Now, a cell phone can't cook anything, all right? Mobile phones do not pop popcorn. That was a fraud. They don't make any heat that we know of, otherwise they wouldn't be permitted. We are seeing women who keep cell phones in their bras. Our first case report from 2009, and we now have many more. This was a Chinese-American woman who used her cell phone 4 hours a day in her bra for 10 years while she was driving. Now, and you drive with a phone on your body. The phone is smart. It's going to go from one tower to another, and it's going to say, here I am, where are you, here I am. And it's going to be going to max power each time it moves from one cell tower to another. And there it was right next to her chest. And the tumors that developed right under the antenna of the phone. Unusual tumors. This is an MRI of a young woman, very brave young woman named Tiffany France. When she was 21, she's now 22, she developed metastatic breast cancer. This is metastases into her chest wall right here. And this outlined the phone. And it was subcutaneous, so it's like right under the surface of the skin. It was not deep within the breast. Most breast cancer occurs in women over 50. It occurs in the upper outer quadrant. these tumors occur right under the antenna of the phone. Prenatally exposed mice have hyperactivity as adults. And these are some of the data. They have worse memory, they're more hyperactive, they have more anxiety, but they don't have much fear. It's kind of interesting. And because of that, that is why we've developed the Baby Safe Project, working with colleagues at Yale University and around the world. Now, how many of you had heard that in 2011, the World Health Organization had reviewed all of the evidence and decided that mobile phone radiation was a possible human carcinogen? The number of people using cell phones today and using them heavily today is very different than it was even 5 years ago, even 3 years ago. Now you're being encouraged to have unlimited talk and text, right? You didn't have unlimited talk and text 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So the uses and the users of phones are changing radically. In fact, most epidemiologic studies find no increased risk of brain cancer from mobile phone radiation. They don't. Until 10 years of heavy use. And by the way they define a cell phone user in these studies, I'm not making this up, is somebody who makes one call a week for 6 months. Sponsored research, this is to put it politely, can induce publication bias. Another way to say this is that where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit and who's bought your chair. And there's a tremendous amount of sponsored research by people who are hired to do studies to find no effect. And that's plagued this field in a number of countries, including within the government itself. In the United States today, the gentleman who is directing the Federal Communications Commission, Tom Wheeler, was for 10 years the executive director of the Cell Phone Telecommunications Industry Association. And now he's in charge of regulating those devices. In France, there's a ban on advertising to young children, under age 12, by the way. All cell phones have to be sold with earpieces. There has to be labeling of the specific absorption rate on phones, and there's got to be warnings. In India, they've lowered their tower limits to 1/10 that of the international standards, and they have official guidelines for cell phone use, using headsets and speakerphones. The Supreme Court in India has actually ordered a number of towers to be torn down. But it's a very tough battle to have to fight. Israel, which is a country that has a lot of important issues to deal with right now, has a National Institute on non-ionizing radiation. They say no Wi-Fi in kindergarten. They all prefer wired over wireless in schools. All phones, again, are to come with headsets and safety. And no advertising with children. In Belgium, the law has been implemented as of 2014. It was passed in 2013. No phones are to be designed or sold for children under the age of 7. Again, all handsets must be sold with headsets. And the sale to young children is specifically prohibited. Prohibited. Canada has issued practical advice as well. The Canadian Parliamentary Health Committee has urged that there be a recognition that this is a, quote, serious public health issue. Vodafone has to provide a report to the American government as part of their annual reporting to the Security and Exchange Commission. They must report on what are called risk factors and uncertainties. And they report that they face risks because they may have to pay people for health damages. The last sentence there, a change to this view that there's no health problem could result in a major reduction in phone usage or major litigation. That's a risk. China Mobile, in their report to the US Securities and Exchange Commission, they had to say, we cannot be certain that future studies will not impute a link between electromagnetic fields and adverse health effects. And because of that, it's a potential risk as well. AT&T says unfavorable litigation could result and require us to pay significant amounts of money.
Things that may not affect us as adults can affect the fetus. Not only that, whatever happens to the fetus when those organs are developing, if they don't develop properly, that's it. You're stuck with those organs for life. It is a vulnerable time and a time that really carries forward into the future. Not only some of these agents that are harmful from the environment, but all sorts of things we could do better to make sure we have healthier lives. In women, especially women who are pregnant, who use cell phones during their pregnancy, and children having various behavioral problems due to that cell phone exposure. And other animal species, even the zebrafish model has been used as well, where you can expose a fish to cell phone radiation and see various types of abnormalities, including the type of behavioral abnormalities we saw in mice. So it's correlative in humans, and we see it very clearly in our mouse models, and it affects all sorts of other species as well. This is broadly applicable. Really don't use your cell phone or wireless laptop, certainly on your abdomen. A laptop probably shouldn't be on the lap, especially if you're pregnant.
And so the children have thinner skulls, they have a higher water content because the developing brain, ultimately our brains are predominantly lipid, are fat, but a developing brain has more water than fat, and as they age, they produce myelin, that's the coating around the nerve sheath, and that's a fat-based membrane, and so they're vulnerable to all of this electromagnetic radiation at a rate that's 5 times higher. Stem cells are also affected. Also, behavior, memory, learning are also affected. American Academy of Pediatrics already noted, and this is old news, right? But 30 minutes of just increasing screen time with increased risk of extensive speech delay. Memory's affected. We have Europeans involved. ADHD, as he mentioned, with the perinatal studies in 5 countries, in Northern Europe and Spain, and also the neuropsychiatric effects of over 26 studies showing fatigue, headache, nausea, and symptoms of electrohypersensitivity. Cell phones, headaches, and migraines. NIH actually funded a research study on over 50,000 children, and both prenatal and postnatal exposure to cell phones had more migraines and headache-related symptoms, and this is actually unusual for more mainstream researchers to actually conclude that the findings actually show that smartphone electromagnetic radiation can actually trigger effects. Microwaves produce neuropsychiatric effects, including depression. And so what's the mechanism of this? And in the interest of time, I had to sort of dial down, how does all this happen? What's going on between the electromagnetic fields coming from a cell phone and the cells? And so what's happening is that our brains, our bodies, our most vulnerable organs are actually our hearts and brains, are powered cellularly by an energy pump within the cell called the mitochondria. And the mitochondria have membranes. And these cells are affected by these radio frequency fields, and actually the cellular DNA and the mitochondrial DNA are both affected. And so what's happening is there's a stress reaction. And so the cells are literally stressed, and then we have things called voltage-gated calcium channels that, if you can imagine a cell membrane, our radio frequency radiation affects these voltage-gated calcium channels. They're channels where you see molecules going through the cell membranes, and those are all affected. The neurotransmitters are affected, and as Hugh mentioned, hormonally, there's also neuroendocrine cells, and those are also affected. There's a thing called oxidative stress, and so there's a well-known pathway in medicine, which again relates back to the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and there's actually slides that had to delete that showed how the hydrogen bonds in the helical DNA are affected by radio frequency radiation. Having a brain tumor, whether benign or malignant, is a life-changing event. And so no matter that we may have the most wonderful surgeries to resect these, no matter that maybe it's a benign tumor and the patient can have a successful resection, it's still a traumatic event for the patient and their family. And it puts them at risk, not only just being in a hospital, but for infection. And so it's really better to go through life without contracting a brain tumor. And what you see here is an aggressive brain tumor. It's likely a glioblastoma, GBM. You see on the upper right picture, that's the slice through the side, and you can see the white part. So that's just an example of what brain tumors look like. And these can present where the patient has been minimally symptomatic, kidney, liver, thyroid, all increasing over the last years and also increasing up until now. These are earlier studies. 4,600 people, as in children and adolescents, are diagnosed with a brain tumor each year. And the last line relates back to a Blue Cross Blue Shield study that was published just a few years ago that showed the overall cancer rates are rising profoundly in millennials. So they were 20s to 30s, and now they're approaching 40s, but now we have thyroid and rectal cancers and brain tumors, not to mention suicide, depression, and stroke, all increasing in this population. And as Hugh mentioned, yes, things are multifactorial. Is it solely the effect of our cell phones? No, not necessarily. We have toxins in our environment. But the fact is that we have never had more electromagnetic frequency up until now. In other words, it's never been, this is the highest rate that we have ever achieved in electromagnetic frequency in ambient environments in our world, and it's higher than it was when even those studies were published. As early as the 1990s, they found effects of radio frequency that involve brain cancer, heart, oxidative changes, reproductive changes, sleep changes at levels of radio frequency exposure that were all below the recommended FCC and Canadian limits. And so at these low exposures, all of these studies found significant effects. If we look at PET scans in those patients who are exposed to cell phone radiation, and we look at the outcomes, we see that they end up metabolizing glucose, which is given to them as an isotope. They metabolize glucose in place of the oxygen. So what does that mean? That means that when the brains are exposed to cell phone radiation, they are not oxygenating well. They have to utilize glucose to process cellular function. And this is as old as 2012. So wireless radiation is, in fact, a neurotoxin. It's toxic to cells. Loss of memory, cells deteriorate in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the inferior part of the temporal lobe that's responsible for our memory. Oxidative stress, I already mentioned. Demyelination. Demyelination is what happens when the lining of the nerve cells in the spinal cord and even in the brain deteriorate. It's the common occurrence that happens with multiple sclerosis. We mentioned oxidative stress already. I think the blood-brain barrier is very important to mention here in terms of what happens to our brains when we're exposed to cell phone radiation. The hippocampus is that area just here, below in the inferior temporal lobe. And when we do blood-brain barrier studies, what is the blood-brain barrier, actually? The blood-brain barrier is the microscopic interface of microvessels adjacent to neurons. And so this blood-brain barrier is an integral part of how our brains function and metabolize oxygen and glucose and food. And it's a very delicate thing, and it's something that we learn as neurosurgeons to actually manipulate in terms of head trauma or brain tumor patients when we see patients in the acute setting. And now we have evidence that when we expose brains to microwave radiation, we have leakage out of those vessels that I mentioned in the form of albumin, which is a protein. And we can see on the slide on the left is before, the control, and after the exposed brain has the leakages of the albumin. There have been multiple studies on people living near cell towers, even dating back even before this one. It was an early 2000 study of firefighters adjacent to cell phones with multiple symptoms, brain tumors also. India has actually banned cell towers in higher populated areas. I think we need to take their lead.
The government limits are 26 years old. The current standards for every one of the world's 8 billion phones and many more devices are 26 years old. And the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals was so appalled by that, that when our organization sued and asked for an update of the standards, the court ruled that we had established the failure of the FCC to provide a record of reasoned decision-making. An agency is free to look at the record and disagree with what's submitted, but they have to give reasons. They can't just say, never mind. We happen to know that that's exactly what happened in the final decision when the rule was issued just before December of 2019. And the court ordered that the FCC had got to address the impacts of radiation in children. And we've heard, I think, from the talks today so far why that's so important. The court also held that there was a failure to consider any of the evidence on environmental effects. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about in a moment today. But I want to add one new finding from your colleagues at Yale, which is a study funded by the American Cancer Society, published just 2 years ago, looked at specific genetic mutations called SNP, single nucleotide excision repair, and found that people that had a fairly common SNP had a very high rate of thyroid cancer associated with cell phone use. And this was a rather robust study published in a very important journal, and yet we hear very little public discussion about this issue. Where is the thyroid? Here. You heard about acoustic aroma? Here. The brain tumors we're concerned about? Here. They're all right within the flow of cell phone radiation. Now, we are concerned about the deployment of 5G, and this community should be especially concerned. And in order for 5G to work, you need a 5G phone, a 5G router, a 5G computer. All their devices have to be new. 5G becomes a very effective marketing scheme. What I can tell you is that these studies that I'm showing you here have modeled how much more radiation exposure there would be if 5G existed at the current permitted levels. So you see on the left of the image in front of you what you have currently simulated for Austin, Texas. And then on the right, you see what would be permitted with 5G. And by the way, that's what is now permitted in the town of Jackson. 5G only works ideally in an urban setting anyhow, because you need an antenna every 100 yards or so, and they have to be able to talk to one another and form beams. Antennas are found much closer to ground than they're supposed to be. They're put on things that look like street lamps, but they're not. All of those lovely street lamps that you see going into Jackson are in fact cameras, which is not a bad thing because you can tell if somebody's here who's up to no good, but they all can become 5G antennas very, very easily. And what we don't want to see happening is this exposure to take place without a full assessment of the environmental impacts that this radiation can have. Here is an example that you might not have thought of. This is a study of how radio frequency radiation can damage trees. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist to see clear evidence that the side of the tree closest to the tower there is dying. And it will take this tree another 10 years till the whole tree eventually is sicker and may not survive. Now, honeybees and pollinating insects are critically important for agriculture. There are over 2,000 different pollinators. It's not just the honeybee. And we see the hummingbirds are pollinators. And this study modeled the honeybee body. And you can see that the 2 gigahertz, which would have been the old radiation exposure, it goes through. The color of red indicates highest exposure. But at 24 gigahertz, which is what 5G can be, it doesn't exist yet, but it can be, it goes entirely through and literally lights up the body of the bee. And that's an experimental study that has been done. Other studies have shown that there's reduced motor activity in worker bees. There's something called a piping signal that they do in order to tell one another to get to work and what they're supposed to do. And the worker bees and the bees that are supposed to be the defender bees, all of them show problematic behavior with exposure to this radiation in experimental studies that have been done where you take beehives and you put a phone in the hive, you put another hive with a phone in it, and it's not operating, and you turn on the phone in the one, you don't turn it on in the other, and then you have a control hive with nothing. And significant evidence occurs. Ultimately, the queens stop doing their job, which is to make lots and lots of eggs, to make more bees, to make more honey. And there have been a number of studies showing this, not just one. Our website has information on this. These ads were boasting how tobacco was safe and refreshing and invigorating. And yes, he's adding that they died at about the age of 45 because some of them were so heavy, such heavy smokers. In my secret history book, I talk about the fact that the tobacco industry funded the National Cancer Institute to $11 million to make a safe cigarette in the 1970s. In the 1970s, and the head of the National Cancer Institute was a 4-pack-a-day smoker. So we've come a long way from the time when we believed that tobacco was good for you. And I think, unfortunately, we need to take a step back from our enthusiasm with the blessings of the technology.
Smart lighting, smart speakers, smart everything, and then a cell tower might be near your home or in your community nearby. The FCC was the agency, and it was within FCC limits. That's the agency in our country that has authority over cell towers and cell phone radiation. And as I looked in the research, I was shocked to learn the vast amount of research that we have on this subject, showing harm at levels that are well below our FCC limits. So in our lawsuit, I want to talk about this a little bit, Environmental Health Trust et al. Versus the FCC. The court noted a few things, a lot of things actually, but that there was silence from the agencies that you might expect would be responding. So they asked the EPA, the FDA, the Department of Labor, the National Cancer Institute, and other agencies to comment on our FCC limits. I mean, are they safe? What does the science say? Because the FCC is not a health and safety agency. And they were silent. There wasn't a response, except for from the FDA, which the court found to be cursory. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In the decision, it was found that the FCC's decision to not to update, not to change those 1996 limits was arbitrary and capricious, and that the FCC had ignored issues of long-term exposure, issues of children's vulnerability. In fact, Dr. Taylor's research was one of the prominent studies that we had submitted onto the record. The testimony of injured people and science showing impacts to the developing brain and reproductive organs. And the court also said that the FCC had completely ignored the issue of impacts to wildlife. The bottom line is that FCC limits cannot be thought of as resting on an up-to-date scientific review. The EPA, the CDC, the National Cancer Institute, the FDA, and the Department of Labor have not looked at all of the science. And that's the bottom line. There was no pre-market safety testing for long-term exposure. There's no post-market surveillance for health effects. There's no monitoring of the radio frequency levels that we're exposed to every day. You're seeing in my community, this is an apartment building with a cell tower popped on 27 feet from the homes, right near bedroom windows. In other countries, there's monitoring for what radio frequency levels we're exposed to. We measure air pollution here. We measure contaminants in water, but we're not measuring the radio frequency level exposures. And there's no evaluation of workplace exposures either. Our FCC limits were not even designed to consider impacts to birds, bees, or trees. There's no environmental assessment that has been done on the 5G rollout, despite the fact that the FCC is proposing nearly 1 million new wireless facilities in the United States alone, and there'll be billions of new wireless devices, machines and smart things and all kinds of things we can't even imagine right now for the 5G Internet of Things. So when you go to the FDA website, it says scientific evidence for cell phone safety, and there's even a section that says no new implications for 5G. But actually, there hasn't been research on impacts to the brain by the FDA, impacts to reproduction, children's vulnerability, and of course, not on wildlife. And research hasn't been done by the FDA on impacts from millimeter waves, which are going to be used in new 5G networks. We're going to be using sub-millimeter and millimeter waves, as well as the current frequencies that we use now. There are many governments around the world that are addressing this They still have a long way to go, but they are far ahead of the United States. And we need to be, I think the United States needs to be on the forefront of this, so we have a lot of work to do. For example, many governments, France, United Kingdom, Spain, Austria, Switzerland, and so forth, several countries, they measure radio frequency radiation. They have public websites where you can go online, pick your location, and see what the radio frequency levels are. You can even, if you live in France, you go to your mayor and you say, I'd like to know what the radiation is right outside my door. And actually, they put in a request, measurements are done, and you're given that information. So there's a lot of transparency. France also has a 5G monitoring station, several places across Paris. It's really interesting if you're interested in this subject to go online and see that. There's also many bans and restrictions on Wi-Fi in schools, bans in kindergarten and nursery schools. Belgium, as well as many private schools, are doing this across the world. In France, in Israel, Cyprus, which also has a directive taking Wi-Fi out of elementary schools, and French Polynesia as well.
A major development from California's Department of Public Health. High use of cell phones may be linked to certain types of cancer and other health effects, including brain cancer and tumors, lower sperm counts, headaches, and effects on learning, memory, hearing, behavior, and sleep.
If it was a real problem, I would know. If it was a real problem, the government would protect us. How come I'm not hearing about this? They're all things I've heard when I give seminars. I get up there and they say, oh yeah, if this was really a problem, they would have told us. I am they. I am a, legitimate scientist, and I am telling you.
I would like to discuss the science and risks. Let me start with the environmental studies. I have learned that the Earth's natural electromagnetic field, which is meant to regulate the electrical systems of all living cells, pulses just 7.83 times per second. That is measured in hertz. Currently, our wireless signals carry our data back and forth using man-made microwaves at a pulse 1,000,000 times per second in the megahertz range and 1,000,000,000 times per second in the gigahertz range. Again, the Earth pulses at just 7 times per second. Invisible man-made radiation constantly overpowers that. Our birds, bees, and pollinators have built-in navigation systems that are meant to be synchronized with the Earth's electromagnetic field. That's how they get back and forth to their nests and hives. The science shows the increasing electropollution is dysregulating their navigation systems. 4G, or fourth generation technology, uses long waves to carry data and signals. 5G, or fifth generation, uses these longer waves too, but is now adding an additional layer of short millimeter waves that are about the same size as many of our pollinators.